You're listening to the Zen Cop Podcast.
All right, guys, welcome back. Mac Rollins, Zen Cop here. This will be episode 2 of the Zen Cop podcast, season 2, and I am stoked because I have JT from Survive Policing back on the show again. His episode was one of the most viewed I had, and also I got a lot of people that hit me up for feedback and wanted him back on. So JT, thank you for being here. I really appreciate you being back on the show.
Yeah, great to be here. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's definitely, I know when you shared that with me, that's definitely humbling. So, yeah, that feedback is definitely appreciative. Definitely not what I expected, but yeah, very appreciated.
Awesome. And then, so for those who didn't listen or don't know, just give me a quick kind of synopsis of your kind of just your bio, what you did and what you're doing now.
Yep. So spent 14 years in law enforcement, 4 of those years on the military side, 10 on the civilian side with a large county agency. Got out of law enforcement in 2021. That's when I started Survive Policing, again, just kind of as a just a hobby and kind of as something that I had a vision for, of helping cops in some way. Based on a lot of circumstances that I had gone through, my experiences not only in law enforcement but in my personal life. It kind of took off from there after a couple of years. Started getting a lot of good feedback. Connected with a ton of police officers, not only across the U.S. but across the world at this point. And just kind of kept going with it. Kept growing. We're almost at present time, almost to 20,000 followers. Hopefully, going to hit that pretty soon on Instagram. Done a lot of different things. Just talking with cops. I hop on calls with police officers all the time. Field a lot of questions, particularly from younger officers, which I'm sure that you do too. Again, the community itself is interesting in law enforcement. There's obviously a big need for I think mentorship, and particularly again over the past few years. Some of the things that we had talked about, obviously. Whether you talk about Freddie Gray or George Floyd, COVID, everything that's kind of happened over the past couple of years, not only in law enforcement but across society in the United States, has really created a need for people out there that are looking for advice, or just even whether they're looking to figure out if they should get into law enforcement or if they should get out. And obviously I've been in and I've been out, so I have I'd like to think somewhat of a unique perspective on things. Obviously not the only perspective, but I've been fortunate enough to kind of build a little bit of following and really connect with a ton of guys and hopefully make some positive impact, in the community. That's really the mission and the goal. So, yeah, I think it kind of brings us up to today. Obviously we had, the first episode, we went to a lot of great topics, but ultimately just here to try to give back to the community, be there as whatever knowledge I have to try to transfer to others, and just, give back however I can.
Nice. It's funny. We were kind of talking offline before we started, and I had posted in a story last week. It was just sort of some basic stuff on how to, de-stress. And one of the slides, or the story slides, it's just a job. And a buddy of mine who I respect dearly, he became a RTO. That's a recruit training officer. Just the big scary guy from the academy who scares the shit out of you for 6 months and makes you into a good cop. So when he got that position, it was pretty cool because I told him, I said, you're going to just terrorize so many kids in a great way and make them great cops. And he DM'd me and said, no, it's not just a job, it's a calling. And I was kind of like, oh yeah, it's everything's so subjective. And Steve, if you're listening, thank you, because that really sort of hit a speaking point for me in terms of, with all of the, we keep saying kids, but the funny thing is that we are the older guys now. I'm 38. This is year 14 for me. So yeah, we are the older, not necessarily the old guys, but we're now the older group in the agency. And what advice or what messages in context to what you just talked about, 2020, all this horrible shit that we went through over the last 3 years, which I feel like is finally subsiding. We're finally losing a lot of that negative energy and just the overall just totality of it. And, we, as much as you and I share similar viewpoints on, the job aspect and getting out when you should, there's also a huge sort of effort that needs to be diverted into keeping cops as cops. And, this gig generation that we talked about before, just sort of going from job to job. And Steve was right. This is a calling. It is a job, but that calling aspect, that's something that you talk about a lot. And if there were, and I know there are some of the newer guys or even potential cops that are listening right now, for that, I guess, speaking point in terms of the fact that this is a calling. What would you say to them if they said, like, is it a job or a calling, or is it both? I think it's a combination, a little bit both, but it's person to person, I guess.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I would say, my opinion is also it's both. Kind of where I lie on that issue, if we want to call it an issue, or maybe just a fairly deep question once we get into it, is I'd be lying if I said that I didn't come into this job as thinking it was my calling too, right? Maybe that's not exactly how I thought of it, but again, I was 18, 19 years old trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. And I had no interest in going into law enforcement at that time. I remember I was in college, to be quite honest, was pretty bored. Didn't know what I wanted to do. I went to college. I had an interest in business and entrepreneurship. But I didn't know what I wanted to do with that. And the one thing that, drove me towards law enforcement, one was, it was a couple things. Obviously, this was a few years after 9/11. I think that for, people our age, that had a huge impact on, our generation of just wanting to serve or give back. The other big thing was, my grandfather, who served 35 years as a police officer. And I remember, again, it wasn't something I had really thought about until I was 18, 19 years old. But I remember thinking, he was always a real tough guy, much tougher back then than he is now. He's softened a little bit over the years, but obviously well respected, very accomplished, and lived a good life. Retired with a pension. Actually left the job the first time. Went and bought a farm down in Virginia and raised cattle for about 8 years. Ended up going back into the job, became the chief of police of a small town in Virginia. And so overall, served 35 years. And I just remember thinking, man, that's a pretty good gig, right? You do your 25, 30 years, you get out and you're good for the rest of your life, right? That's kind of how a lot of us kind of get into the job to begin with, is thinking, oh, that pension, safe, job security, stuff like that. But yeah, and I got into it, and there's points of law enforcement that I loved. Obviously, there's challenges. There's things that none of us enjoy doing. I think in terms of calling law enforcement or any job, any occupation as a calling, I think the question really comes down to is, at what point does that become a detriment to those that are within the profession? And by that, I mean, I think when we internalize anything as being a calling, right? If we're then faced with circumstances that are pushing us away from that profession, whether that's something we can control or something we don't, right? Great example of, if you get injured on the job and injured to the point where you can't do the job anymore, does that now, how do you deal with that mentally, right? And a lot of officers I've spoken to that have gone through that, it's difficult, as you can imagine. When life takes, quote unquote, your calling away, what are you left with, right? So in that sense, again, I think I kind of think of any profession, any occupation as, and again, not to go too deep spiritually, but I do believe in some level of fate. I don't think it's as simple as we might like to talk about it sometimes, but I think we're all designed and created to do something within our lives. I think we also get into things and think that we're there, and once we kind of discover what that is, that's going to be it, and we're the only ones that are in control of that destiny. The reality is that's not the case, right? So when we internalize, and again, I think it's more of a question of not, is law enforcement a calling for many individuals, but is it smart to internalize that, right? Because I think it just does a detriment to a lot of people, and not just, not just the example of officers that get injured and can't do the job, but what if you're facing circumstances where other parts of your life or other parts of the world are pulling you in a different direction, and you get into this battle, in whether it's in your own head or in many cases, unfortunately, in law enforcement, with people you love. How many marriages and relationships that we've seen kind of crumble because of this, this idea that, hey, we either fall in love with the job, or we believe like, hey, this is what I'm meant to do, or we've just done it for so long that's the only thing we know how to do, right? My personal experience definitely faced some hardship there, where I was to a point where I was just so in love with the job that my personal life and my relationships definitely took a toll, or were damaged in many ways. So I don't think it's it's not an easy answer. I think I certainly don't have the answer. I would say I err on the side of cautioning, particularly young people who are getting into the job with this idea that it's the only thing they're meant to do. I really think that that does a disservice to anyone who thinks that there's only one thing that they can do in life. And again, as a profession, as a community, and this is not the only one. I imagine, I at least know from personal experience that there's, other communities. The military, I think, is one. Probably, nurses, firefighters, stuff like that, where we do a really good job of making people feel a sort of one way if they decide that they're going to move on to something else, or if they even have aspirations of doing anything else besides law enforcement. We could probably go kind of deep into that topic, but ultimately, I think when we manifest this idea that, again, there's only one thing that we're meant to do, it's going to cause a lot of people to stay in this job that either shouldn't be in this job, or would be better off getting out, at least, before their time is kind of has kind of passed them by, right? And again, like, we're talking about an issue that every person's unique. We can't give a universal answer to this. I think what we can do is just give people the, again, like, one of the things I say, and I don't know if I think sometimes this is not well understood, but one of the things I say is, I'm here for the cops, not the profession. And what I mean by that is I care more about the police officers than the job itself, because I believe that everyone deserves the right to say when they want to leave this job and why. Again, that doesn't always happen, unfortunately, but everyone should at least operate with the idea that they have the personal sovereignty to make that decision. And if they make that decision, who is somebody else to tell, to make you feel bad about that decision, right? It was something I posted recently, I think, where something along the lines of, like, what a profession it is where somebody else feels the need that they get to decide how much you sacrifice for it, right? I think we need to break that mentality, in particular with younger officers, where we need to stop making them feel like shit if they've gotten to this job and find out it's not for them, or they get into this job and find out, hey, like, maybe this isn't working for my family, or maybe this is something that I want to do for a few years, but I want to do something else too. The idea that we demean those people for wanting to make that decision is kind of sad to me. We have that dichotomy, though, too, of when, unfortunately, we see a lot of those officers that either spend an entire career not really doing the job, right, which is just as much of a disservice as anything, or those officers that spend a few years in and they get out and they didn't really do much on the job, so they Um, they kind of take on the persona of being a police officer. Sometimes they use that, particularly now and with social media, they use that as a stepping stone to whatever they want to do next, which is kind of sad. But I think at the end of the day, what I hope is for every officer to at least just know that they have the personal sovereignty to be able to make the choice for themselves. Um, who says a calling isn't for a limited time, right? Um, and when we talk about officers that do leave the profession, whether it's by choice or, again, like officers that spend 30, 40 years in this job that get out don't necessarily have it any easier than those that get out with less time than that, right? And sometimes it's more difficult because, again, I think we do a great job of really beating it into everyone's heads that, hey, like, you got into this, either you stay in and or you get out and it wasn't for you, or you couldn't handle it. That's the one thing I you see a lot of comments on social media, which is kind of silly. I don't even read comments a lot, but when you see that one comment about whoever it is, someone that's gotten out of law enforcement, and they say, you couldn't hack it, or you couldn't handle it. What a sad thing to say to somebody that you don't even know. I don't know what other professions you'd find that in. I get maybe there are some, but it seems to be something that we see in law enforcement all the time. And again, it's kind of sad. So I kind of lean in the other direction of making sure people know that, hey, like, this is your choice to make. If you're gonna do the job, I think you do it the way it's supposed to be done. I think we talked about on the first episode we did that, like, I don't understand why someone would get into the job to not want to do the work. It doesn't make sense to me. There's so many other things that you can do. Again, when we talk about a calling, if you're going to do this type of job that's so difficult, so stressful, why wouldn't you do it the way that it's meant to be done? And why wouldn't you get the benefits out of it that, to me, is the most fulfilling part of the job, which is actually doing the work, going out there, looking for bad guys, trying to make cases, being there for your partners, right? Being there on the calls that matter. It's tough. I think, hopefully that sheds a little bit of light onto that. But yeah, I mean, I know your opinion is kind of, we agree on some things, and we obviously, I think we have different perspectives on some of those types of issues. But I think where do you kind of lean in that direction, or what direction you kind of lean into?
I think it's really subjective. Like, if we were to think of ourselves as robots, it'd be, okay, cool, here's what we're capable of, here's what we can do. And the analogy that I compare a lot, or think of when I think of individual people, if we were all cars and we're the same kind of system, and we have all the same equipment to some degree, but the miles, is it a commuter car that drove from Northern California to Southern California on Highway 5, or was it someone who did off-roading in the Baja area and raced? The cars would have different things wrong with them if they had only had 20,000 miles each, but they were very different roads. The cars would feel different. They would have different reactions to different things. So in that regard, I think it really comes down to the individual. And you hit the nail on the head with what you started talking about with people who shouldn't be here. And I believe that there's a fine line between, and we're seeing it now where we have FDOs who are essentially going, yeah, we have to make this work. Well, we shouldn't have to make it work. And that's a admin issue. That's a body or retention issue. That's a whole nother rabbit hole to go down. But I would hate to see a trainee. And I'm all for remediation, and we can fix things. Nobody's perfect, and we can fix things. But if it's not getting fixed, then we got to cut them loose. And it's perfectly acceptable to understand, and fairly early on, that you were not meant for this job. And that's totally okay, because I would hate to see that person commit to that job, and later on, whether it's their health, their mental health, all of it just sort of goes out the window because they, chose to stick around. And in particular, I feel like the calling aspect goes hand in hand with a sort of, warrior guardian mentality, where we have those two very different approaches right now. And doing the work, ever since I've been a cop, there's been the guys who just kind of want to have the gun and badge and, drive around and look cool. And then there's the guys who really do the work. And then there's the guys who dive deep and they invest a lot of their own emotional intelligence, and just they devote themselves to their community, and they do it for the right reasons. And at the end of the day, they'll live a much more fulfilled life. They pay a price because that's not free. Your body writes a check when you devote a high level of, not necessarily personal connection, but it's hard to not leave some of these things that we do and have some type of connection to that incident. It's impossible not to. And the people who say, the famous words, "Oh, it doesn't affect me," it does. Your brain will take snapshots of those horrible things you see, and it will come back eventually. And there's a small percentage of society that's able to just kind of do the job, and all is well. And there's a lot of people who can't. And unfortunately, we have all seen the worst case scenarios of those outcomes. And I think that there's a lot to be said about the calling aspect, because that should be, for me, I really had no interest in law enforcement. I grew up skateboarding, and I just didn't have a bad relationship with cops. They were actually pretty cool where I was. And I always knew, though, that I wanted to do something that involved public service, that involved giving back. And I liked that stuff. And I never wanted to be a firefighter. I was looking into like paramedic and nursing and stuff like that. And then law enforcement kind of fell into my lap, happenstance. And I just sort of went with it. And I will say that a lot of the best cops I know, they're not living the lifestyle of a cop, keyword life, style. Like it's not your life. It's a job. And I know we don't know each other personally, but if you were to bump into me on the street, yeah, I mean, you kind of have that cop vibe no matter what you do. I think it's more of how you carry yourself. But for me, I'm not wearing 511s with a full size Glock 17 on my hip that you can read the serial number through my shirt. Like I'm pretty minimal when it comes to that stuff. I'm safe, and I take my job off duty very seriously because I have a family and kids, but I don't let it consume the parts of the job that consume me are what I think are the appropriate parts. And that's the work. Those are the things that I oftentimes will think about or dwell on. And out of all the horrible stuff we see, you just can't help but the times where you fail, especially where you didn't do something, and not necessarily failed in the sense that you screwed anything up, but you didn't get what you wanted, or the victim didn't get what they wanted. And that can, that was sort of a long off ramp. But I think if more younger kids understood that there's a mental and physical tax that comes with this job that you're going to have to pay eventually. And if they understood that, and a lot of the stuff that you talk about and post about is spot on. And there's a guy, Ed Calderon, he has a podcast as Manifesto. It's a really good, but he talks about all the time, stay out of the comments. Don't look at the comments. And it's funny because when you dive in there, I don't know if half of them are just, trolling or whatever, but there's so much like just negative commentary and lots of guys just talking shit to each other who don't even know each other. And even some of the people have said stuff to me where I'm like, what? But I always respond with something really nice, and it seems to kind of just make it stop. But it's like, why are we so cynical and judgy, and everyone's just out there? I hate saying dick measuring contests. There's a lot of girls out there too. So just, I guess, a measuring contest of one's self-worth, but it's just, it's toxic. And I recently said something online where it was like, it holds the toxicity level of a girl's locker room in high school. Like it's just, we're worse than that. And nothing against girls' locker rooms, but you guys usually talk the most shit. No offense to girls listening. My wife would raise her hand if she was in here. But my point is that we are just so self-loathing, and it's crazy. I know you've seen that a lot with what you do. And I don't know if there's a cure for that. I think it's online. I don't think that if we had a big room and everyone could talk, half those people wouldn't say anything. But
well, like I think there's a portion of like, and I don't know what percentage this would be, but there's certainly a percentage of people that become attracted to the job that are they're not the right people that we should be attracting, right? I mean, everyone knows those people. There is some irony in the idea that, something that you had mentioned, all the best cops I've ever known never took themselves that seriously. They took the job seriously. They didn't take themselves that seriously. I think the best cops I've ever known all understood, like, hey, I'm one of many. There's no all stars out there. We all strive to do good work, but we understand that like we're never gonna be God's gift to policing. Some of us do better than others. I think it's I think you have those officers that they believe that they were, and again, when we talk about like phrases like, it's a calling, you have those officers that again really internalize that type of thing, and they believe that they're the one, right? Like they're the one that's supposed to save, protect people, save people, whatever it is. Ironically, a lot of those same people are the ones that, they have a, thin blue line tattoo or something, but they haven't made an arrest for a year, stuff like that, which I don't think we do a good job of highlighting that that's not what this job is about, being humble, having perspective. And again, I think this all goes back to that life experience, right? We talked about that the first time. Like it's so huge because you can, and again, everyone that's been in this job sees those recruits come out of the police academy, and we can almost even pinpoint, okay, like, yeah, this one's going to be in a problem. This one's going to think that they get out to the street and they're just, again, God's gift to policing. Some can change that just through their experiences when they actually get out there and do the job. Others we kind of let get to that point where they're out there doing things that they probably shouldn't be doing, just in terms of, we're trying to fill spots, right? We're trying to fill spots in investigative units, in specialized units. And unfortunately, whether it's this bad now, there's certainly going to be times, there's certainly been times in the past, there's certainly going to be times in the future where we're filling spots with people that aren't qualified to do those spots. And when we talk about, again, retention, it's like these officers that, I think it feels like, could be wrong, feels like the mass exodus has waned a little bit. However, I wonder in terms of recruitment, what that looks like, and I'll just throw out an example. I know that someone I was talking to recently was just kind of expressing the idea of, hey, like we're losing units, we're losing spots in units. And we're not filling that, like we're not replacing them with anyone, right? We're not even sending those spots to patrol. They're just gone, right? Because those spots, they didn't have anyone to fill them, and the people that were filling them just were, might have a few years on the job, just weren't really what at one time was required to be in a position like that. And that's scary, I think. How do we fix that? I think it's something that has to be fixed over time, but unfortunately, I think there's definitely gonna be a snowball effect going forward. That if we're not, again, like recruitment numbers, if it might be anecdotal, but you can look up the stories across the U.S. where recruitment's down. I recall when I was applying to the police department, and I applied to a bunch of places, and this was back in 2010. And the word was like, hey, you got to apply everywhere because competition is stiff, right? Literally thousands of applicants for each department. And now that's not the case, right? It might be whittled down to a few hundred. And so obviously with the sample size or the pool you're pulling from, it's you're going to get low quality candidates in some ways. And when you get out there, who's teaching those low quality candidates to be great cops? It might be other mediocre cops. And so it just kind of goes down the line. It's unfortunate. Like I'll say this, like, again, I came from my dad was in law enforcement. My grandfather, obviously, I grew up not liking cops very much, right? I was kind of a rebellious kid. I think I had some unique life experience, but even now, like I see cops out there, and look, I love police officers. Like I love those who are committed to this job and the mission. But I'll see police officers out there, and I almost snicker to myself. I'm like, who, look at this guy, or look at this one. It's one of those things, man. Like we do it to ourselves. The community does it, does it to itself in some ways. Yeah, going back to the comments too, it's funny because I think that's pervasive in all of social media, probably across the board. It is interesting that people are so quick to judge. Again, you're posting stuff on social media, right? If you come to my page, you come to your page, someone's seeing one post, right? Out of the thousands of things we've posted over years, and they're making a judgment call, which is, again, it makes sense. You do have to wonder, like, who those people are. Sometimes you wonder, like, who is this guy,
Yeah.
right? It's hard not to take that personally sometimes. Again, I think I think even Joe Rogan has said this multiple times, is like, don't even look at the comments. Like, you just post it and be done with it, right? Because you can really get yourself twisted mentally when you're putting yourself out there and putting your opinion or your thoughts out there and just having the world be the judge of it. I do, again, like 99% of my interactions are positive, which is amazing. It's just that 1% that, you know, you can't help it. Like, it digs at you, right? Particularly the ones that either call into question, like, your credibility or your reputation or your experience, stuff like that. I've offered multiple people in the past that have particularly, criticized something I said. It's like, hey, like, let's hop on a call, man. Like, if you think I'm wrong, that's fine, man. Like, I'm not the best cop that's ever walked the earth. Like, I like to think I was at least above average. I tried real hard. I got a lot of good experiences. I was fortunate enough to work with a lot of great cops, man. I landed in some really great teams. But look, not everything I say is perfect, and not everything that I say is going to be something that resonates with people. That's just, again, I just have my unique experience that I can share and hopefully provide some value to some people out there. But, again, like, and kind of going back to the idea of what you want, when you get in this job, what do you want to get out of it? The one thing I'll say, I think, for everyone across the board is, you don't want to get out of this job and not be proud of what you put into it, if that's the right way to put it. I can look back, and I certainly didn't do everything I wanted to do in this job, but every so often I'll go back and look at my resume and look at the different cases I worked, and, like, I can be proud of it. Sometimes I even, like, kind of surprised myself. I was like, oh shit, like, I forgot about that one, or I forgot I was able to be part of this, right? And it's cool, and that feels good. I it gives me some anxiety to think about how many officers are out there that are just kind of wasting away, that when their time comes to step away from the job, they're not going to be able to look back and be proud of what they did. That's really sad to me. I think anyone that whether you spend a year in this job or 30 years, man, like, you've sacrificed something. You've sacrificed something by getting into this job. Again, if people that come in and get through the police academy and maybe spend a year on the road, like, yeah, they didn't have a lot of time in this job, but, like, that was all time they could have been doing something else, right? And I don't think that should be lost on people. Again, like, if you're in this job for 3, 4, 5 years, are you going to get the amount of experience that you will with more time? Of course not. But it doesn't mean you can't be proud of what you did. I do fear that there's a lot of people out there that are not taking advantage of that time that they do have. And that's sad. I think that what kind of comes back to something else I posted about, and I think we had talked about briefly, you can do more in this job in 5 years than a lot of people do in 25 years. Right.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
I don't want, I don't want to say that. That's sad. You know what I mean? Now, on the flip side, right? Can we expect people to do this job for 25, 30 years, day in and day out, foot on the gas every day? Like, I don't. I don't think it's possible. I think there's a level of consistency that you should shoot for. And again, this is something I when I was a FTO, the one thing I would tell rookies was, hey, like, you don't have to go 100 miles an hour every day, but never let your foot off the gas. Like, always be moving forward, because the second you start getting complacent, that can, again, like, extend itself to weeks and months and years, and then after a couple of years of not really putting the work in, you might want to go do something else within the job. And if your resume for the past year, 2 years, 3 years is not filled up, you're going to have some heavy competition by those that kept going, right? Um, when we talk about like what you want to do with this job, it's I think patrol officers are like, there's so much you can do on patrol. There's so much you can do just day in and day out, just being a patrol cop. Like it's we say things like, oh, it's the greatest show on earth, and it's I really do believe that patrol work is like the backbone of a police department. That's the front lines, right? There's so much that can be done. For those that kind of sit back and take so much time off from actually doing the job while they're at work, I don't know how you can be proud of that. I get it. I understand it, particularly when you're going through things in your life that are just, incredibly stressful. It kind of reminds me too, and this was, the episode you did, and I hope you don't mind me referencing it, but about when you kind of, and it was a fantastic story, and a great podcast where you kind of talk about how you discovered that like you were having panic attacks.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually, I was listening to it and I was thinking back about times in my career. And I won't go as far as to say that I was having panic attacks. I don't know, but it definitely had me thinking about these instances where every so often, and I remember pretty clearly, I would, I always worked evening shift in my career, and I would, say goodbye to the family. I would get in the car and I would start driving to work. And I always lived a pretty significant distance from work, intentionally. So I'd have, a 45-minute drive maybe. And I would get on the road and I would have this overwhelming feeling of like anxiety. And particularly, after like if I was coming back from like an extended time off, vacation, or like a long weekend. And it didn't happen all the time, but, every so often I would just get this feeling of like extreme vulnerability and thinking that, I'm going into a job to work the next 10 hours where like, again, not to be, not to exaggerate, but like, hey, like anything could happen. Like I could get killed within this next 10 hours.
Yeah.
And just that feeling of just, anxiety that would come over. And I don't know if it was a panic attack or if it was just anxiety. It was just the stressors of the day. But that type of feeling, again, can definitely drive someone in this job to get to work and just want to go hide somewhere, right?
For sure.
Uh,
Especially if they don't want to, like, not to cut you off, but that was I think every new cop has that feeling. What scared me is when I stopped feeling that way. When I became so used to it that it went away. My wife, when I first became a cop, I remember like my first shift, like leaving, it was this big hug and kiss, and that kept happening. And after like the second week, I was like, stop, we have to stop doing this. Kiss me on the cheek. I'm leaving. I'll be back in 12 hours. Like, stop making this dramatic event. And the likelihood of any of us getting hurt is very slim, but it's the context to where, it's every possible call we go to, not just, okay, at noon, there's going to be a bank robbery. No, it's anytime, anywhere. So I used to have that. And I think any cop should have that feeling. If you're not having that feeling, there's something wrong with you. But when it goes away, that's where I started to go, oh my God, like, am I just becoming numb to this? And now my body's having this chemical dump that's going to eventually kill me. And I just don't feel it anymore. But yeah, that was an interesting episode. I could have talked about that for probably 4 hours and gone in more detail. But it's definitely one of those things where I think if most cops understood what was coming eventually, I didn't ever think that would ever happen to me. It just wasn't in my cards. Never would have guessed. And I'm not that. I shouldn't say I'm not the person who is like that, but apparently I am. But I think some of those, and I've talked to other cops about it, especially guys that are older than me, and they have told me some very scary stories about just stuff that wasn't allowed to be talked about back in the day. And even as close as the early 2000s, where you just that wasn't an option. Yeah. And for the newer generation, I mean, if there's new guys or even guys who are listening to this right now who the most common question I get is like, hey, like how do I prepare? And it's like, well, I don't know. It's kind of up to you. I can
Yeah.
tell you what worked for me, but if there was, I guess, one thing, and there's a lot of guys who are listening on both of our social media platforms and reading too. If you had to pick maybe one thing that's like, I know there's all these things we can talk about, but for someone who's new, someone who's thinking about, or they're just starting the process, they're in the academy, if there was one thing you could pick to have them either focus on or to just sort of adopt as a mantra, what would it be?
Yeah, I think it would just be one day at a time,
Mm-hmm.
and not only in the academy but in the job. Um, I think there's probably no other job where focus is as important as it is in law enforcement. We can get it's it's funny, we talk about the job itself. You know, we as people in law enforcement are dealing with an extreme level of stress at times, but they're also human beings that are dealing with every other stress that normal people have, right? So you're dealing with the stress of the job, but you're also dealing with the stress of your wife or your husband at home, and the kids, and how do I pay for daycare and all this. And it's like, it's no surprise that we deal with stress and heart issues and pain and injury over time. Like it makes sense. Like that's just what you have to accept getting into the job. But it's so easy to lose focus because you have to be, you have to have a healthy level of awareness every day. If you're going to, make sure that you're going home at night, every night, and just having that focus. I think the best thing to do is just find a way to be present in what you're doing. Easier said than done because, again, of all those other stressors in life, the environment, the things you're dealing with at home, it's tough. I remember when I was going through some really difficult issues in my personal life. It was the first time in my career that I really struggled with maintaining my composure while I was at work. And there was a handful of days where my sergeant pulled me in and he said, "Hey, you got to go home. Like, you can't let this happen." And I know one instance in particular, I won't go too far in the details, but it was something that my focus was just off. And we were looking for, a target. We found them and I got distracted and I lost them. And we ended up finding them later on, but it was, I fucked up and it was an awful feeling. I had a decent excuse for what was going on in my life, but again, that's not something that anyone wants to go through. But everyone in this job, I think, at one point or another is going to go through something like that, where they're just distracted, they're losing focus, and you just can't be completely present. But if you can put everything else out of your mind when you need to, sometimes you got to tell the wife or your husband that, hey, like I got to go, I'm on something, and I'll let you know. If I might text you again in 5 hours from now, but like I need to focus. Maybe that's something that really causes a lot of heartache with relationships in law enforcement. I imagine it does, but I don't think there's another way. But being able to compartmentalize what's going on in your life and focusing on what's in front of you, because that might be the most important thing that you face in your life on any given day. So with focus, obviously taking one day at a time, the healthier you can be mentally, physically, emotionally, that all helps with focus, getting sleep, eating right, exercising, obviously. Like those things sound simple, sound boring sometimes, but like that's where your focus comes from. And if you can stay focused and you can enjoy every day for what it is, again, this can be the greatest job on earth. Even now, I still say, I look back and there's times in my career that I don't think I can ever do something else in my life that'll be as fun as what I did on some days in law enforcement. So take it in stride. Don't take yourself too seriously. Take the job seriously, and remember that today is the day that you're working on. This is what you got to get through, and this is your mission that you need to accomplish today. Tomorrow will come after that's done.
Awesome. You brought up fate earlier, and that's kind of an interesting thing to tie into that, we
Hmm.
can only control so much, and it's everywhere you are is where you're supposed to be, even if it's horrible, even if it's a bad, good. I mean,
Yeah.
I wish every day was great, but it's not. So, um, that's good. I think that's a good takeaway. And hopefully if you're new and you're listening, I mean, talk to as many people as you can. Talk to people who, if they know more than you, just soak it up like a sponge. But,
Yeah.
um, JT, for the people who don't know, how do they get a hold of you, and what is your social media stuff? If you want to throw that out there before we close.
Yeah, it's at Survive Policing. I'm also um, proud to be a new member of the Police Post team, working with the team over there, which has been fantastic, and I hope continue to do work with them. But yeah, at Survive Policing, DMs are always open. Might take a little while to get to it, but yeah, feel free to connect.
I would also recommend, we just talked about staying out of the comments. For JT's page, get in the comments. I read so much, I screenshot so much stuff in your comments where I just go, oh, that's so cool. Like, this makes so much
Yeah,
sense. There's a lot of, there's some jokers in there and there's some naysayers, but the majority of it is, especially when you post questions, I really like
yeah,
reading those responses, and it's really
yeah. There's
motivating.
yeah, there's some great information, and it's so great to see. Sometimes there's some in the past week. I think I posted that, like, the knowledge that you can get from just looking at some of those comments from guys that have way more experience than I do. It's invaluable. So yeah, if you can get past kind of the handful of trolls here and there, just there's great information. In a lot of different pages.
Yeah. Those guys live in their parents' basement anyway and drink Code Red Mountain Dew. Cool,
Yeah.
man. Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna have you back as as time goes on. I think everyone really enjoys your outlook, and genuinely thank you for the content and the information. It's going to help a lot of kids. And as much as we despise social media, I think it's a huge asset to the newer group who's going to be essentially replacing us someday when we retire and call it quits for good. So thank you again, and love to have you back, man.
Yeah, definitely appreciate it.
Awesome, guys. Thank you. This is the end of episode 2, season 2. Stick around for next week. There's a lot of guests that I have in the pipeline. I really want to concentrate on bringing people on the show. I know that was a huge. It was more of a, I guess, a favorite. So, like I said, lots to come. And again, JT at Survive Policing. Thank you for being here, and be safe out there.